so happy we're alive.
About 1983, someone at a meeting stood up and said, a study at the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company showed these numbers. The drug users had these terrible work habits. So Lynn has actually recounted our trying to find out about the Firestone study. It is interesting, of course, that there never was a Firestone study. The thing was completely made up. And I published that in about 1987, 1988, that there never had been a study. And what we ultimately found out was that a man who worked for the EAP, the Employees Assistance Program, had given a speech at Firestone, which was later circulated in a drug information booklet. And what he claimed is that people who came to the EAP, at that time almost all men and women who had trouble with alcohol or other personal problems, had 3.6, 2.4, et cetera, et cetera. But he had no data. All he had were claims of people who came to the EAP. A man named Sidney Cohen, whose name will always be dear to the hearts of some, because in the 1960s, Sidney Cohen turned on half of the white middle-class population of Los Angeles to LSD, all in the service of science. Sidney was a government physician, psychiatrist, very much involved in the early drug studies of the government. Sid turned into being a terrible drug warrior at the end of his life, but early on he thought LSD would save the world. He was very prone to give it to people in Los Angeles. Lots and lots of people owe their beginning drug history to Sidney's casting about acid. I say all these things sorrowing that Sidney is dead because I wish he were alive to answer some of these things. In his drug abuse newsletter published in those days, he cited all the Firestone study figures. And people picked it up from him. In fact, he was the most important source of these numbers. And I wrote him a letter, said, where is the Firestone study? Where is your reference? Where did you get these information? He wrote me back and said, I don't have a copy of the study right now. I never got a chance to ask him, had he had it before. I know that all he had was this little pamphlet that had been mailed out about the EAP. But I could write to the Firestone Firestone Company, and get the data myself, which I proceeded to do. And by 1987, a physician who worked for Firestone named P.Morgan had said that he didn't know why people kept calling him up and asking him about this. There never was any Firestone study. Today, you will still hear these figures cited, and often the Firestone study as a reference. Now, I'm not going to go on too much further, but I'd like to tell you that one of the critical issues in the outcome data arguments were always the fact that people were prepared to accept these claims. And science, early on in drug testing, became a weapon in the propaganda war. In fact, NIDA is truly the ministry of propaganda in the war on drugs. Alan Lesher will stand up and pretend to be a scientist, and we'll talk about the science behind this and the science behind that. NIDA is not a scientific agency. NIDA will give money to scientists, and sometimes, in error, will give money to honest, respectable scientists, won't they? Sometimes they will. And for that, we'd like to say thanks a lot. But NIDA is not a scientific agency. NIDA is the ministry of propaganda in the war on drugs. And they're not worth a glass consumed at the pub because they don't have any scientific credibility or any scientific conscience. So NIDA for a long time let me move around to this. That in the late 1980s, NIDA decided to take on this task of winning urine testing approval for the government, for government testing. And NIDA decided, we'll give some money to people to do outcome studies to show that this works. And there's a 1989 monograph. Some of you know that NIDA every few months publishes a monograph on various scientific things they're interested in. In 1989, there was an entire monograph mostly on workplace outcome studies. The Utah Power and Light studied people who had positive tests for cause. The Southern Pacific Railroad had done a study after they imposed urine testing, there was supposedly a lowering of accidents. Well, there are a couple of interesting things about all the studies cited in the 1989 NIDA monograph. The first is, most of them showed that urine testing had no impact. Did not sanitize the workplace, that people who were tested positive did not have higher health costs, did not have increased accident rates, did not have early termination. And a couple of studies which did show something like that were easily explained on another basis. Let me quickly refer to the... how much time should I take? Thanks. The post office did a study in which they were actually quite criticized because they took people who tested positive at their job interviews and went ahead and hired them and let them work. And they took people who tested negative and constituted a control group. And then compared after a period of time, actually slightly over a year, the outcome of those positive workers versus those negative workers. And the testing industry loved the NIDA study, or I'm sorry, the post office study, because it showed some outcome difference. It showed, for instance, although there was no increased accidents, and there was only a minimal difference in absenteeism, there was early termination. That is, people who were positive were more likely to have left the job within a year. And in fact, it also showed an early firing rate, a higher firing rate of people who tested positive. Now, the scientist who did that study, a man named Jacques Normand, later distinguished himself by doing a very good book on the lack of urine testing accomplishing very much under the sponsorship of the National Science Foundation. But he published the post office studies, and the post office studies did show that people who were positive were fired earlier, and people who were positive more likely quit the job. Now, this is the state of urine testing science. The control group, the positive group were by and large aged 18 to 22. They by and large were African American males. They by and large had little workplace experience. They were new to the world of work and the world of work at the post office. Now, I learned something quite interesting about the control group. The control group, who were people who applied for jobs at about the same time and who were negative, their mean ages were in the 40s. And they were overwhelmingly white. Now, this is, first of all, it tells you something interesting, that having a good civil service gig is still desirable. And these are people with long-time workplace experience, and they were just trying to get jobs with the post office so that they could have security, health benefits, etc., all the things that happen. Now, would you be surprised to compare an 18-year-old African-American male inexperienced work cohort to a 45-year-old largely white experienced work cohort and discover that the white people had more job stability at age 45 than 18-year-old black males? No, you wouldn't be surprised to learn that. And yet, that passes for outcomes science, cited by Mark DiBernardo in the drug testing industry. Now, let me encourage you to go through Lynn's report in some detail, because there actually are a lot of studies, and you'll hear about one other study. But basically, the few adequate studies indicate that, at least in terms of those who test positive in the workplace, overwhelmingly positive for marijuana, the data indicate that these people are not bad workers. That will not come as a surprise to any of you in this room who all know that you can work when you smoke dope if you want to. You can also not work when you smoke dope. But the reality here is